So in this video, I'm going to show you how to set up a very basic service worker. So it should be able to serve as a boilerplate for you. So if you have any projects, you can hopefully extend it to what it is that you need it to be. So if you don't already know what a service worker is, that's okay because it's still a relatively new technology. But very basically, what a service worker is a script that runs independent to the web page. So if you think about your typical JavaScript, you can use it to interact with things in the DOM, but with a service worker, you can't actually do that. And what it actually does instead is does things like background sync and performs push notifications, or what we're going to be working with here, which is handling fetch requests and caching. So it's still a relatively new technology, as I said. As you can see, most browsers don't support it, and even the ones that do don't support it completely fully yet. But it's still a technology worth getting to know now, as it's very powerful and will likely be the backbone of a lot of applications in the future. So in this tutorial, we're going to be setting up this web page. As you can see, it's just a very basic HTML page, but what it does is it pulls this image of Earth from NASA's API. And what we're going to do is set up the service worker to set up caching so that all this information is going to be available even when we're offline. So that's pretty much it. Let's get started. Okay, so to get started, this is just the basic page and you can see it here. So all we have is we're getting the font from Google Fonts, our style sheets, then the basic page, and the image isn't being loaded right now because we're going to get it from the API later, and also loading our script file. So because service workers require us to actually have HTTPS, but while we're working locally, all we need is just a basic server. So here, this is the directory, boilerplate service worker, and we've got a gulp file, and we're using gulp connect here to just set up a basic server. And I'm just running that here. All we need to do is type in gulp when we're in that, and then we can set up. So at localhost port 8889. So the first thing we want to do is actually register the service worker, and we do that in our app file. So if we go to js, app.js, so the first thing we have to do is check if the browser actually even has service workers. So we go if there's service worker in our navigator, then we can actually start. So we go navigator.service worker, and then first .register. I just like to do it on a new line to keep everything by itself. So now we just link to the actual service worker file, and as you can see here, it's in the root directory, so service worker.js. And then we set the scope, and although this is the default, I'm just gonna write it anyway. So the scope is the directory in which that service worker file is in, so this whole source directory, right? So then function registration. So if it was actually successful, let's just do a console log worker registered, and we can pass the registration just the first couple of times so we can see if it works, and catch if there's an error. Just go console.log service worker failed to register, and then pass in that error as well. So let's see if it worked. So we go back here, open this up, and let's just do a hard reload. So it says service worker registered, and then we get this registration. So we can see active, we can see the scope is in that directory, and all of this stuff as well. So I don't want that being passed all the time, so I'm just going to remove the registration. And what we can also do is if we go to here, so Chrome //service worker internals, we can actually see the service worker is here, and here we can stop it, inspect it, unregister, and all of that. Once we've done that, we can now go into the service worker.js and actually start doing stuff. So there are 3 events we're going to be working with. So we're going to have the install event, the activate event, and the fetch event. So I'm just going to set those up so that they are working. Event listener. So first of all, the install event. So function event. So console.log service worker. I'm just gonna put this brackets around so I can tell that these console logs are coming from the actual service worker. So installed, right? .url, so we know the URL that is being fetched. So install, activate, and fetch. We can unregister this if we want, and then maybe do a hard reload and see. Okay, cool. So installed and activate is working now. So the next thing we want to do is work with the cache, and what we want to do is set some files that we just always want to be in cache. So they would generally be local files, but I'm also going to add the Google fonts. So first of all, we have to say what the cache name is, and the reason we do this is so we can set versions on our cache. So we can say if we now update this to version 2, then we can update what's in the cache basically. So then we have the files that we want to cache, and it's just going to be an array of files. So the root, those are what we need to cache always. So on the install event, what we want to do is use this e.wait until. So what this means is that the install event is going to have to wait until the promise within this is going to actually be resolved. So what we want to do is open the cache, right, and open the cache corresponding to this cache name. Then function cache, let's just do console.log. So service worker caching cache files. So what we're doing is actually just caching these files. So I'm just adding that to the console so we can know what's happening. So what we want to do is cache.add all cache files. So that is pretty much it. So what we can do is actually see if it works, right? So that, and then empty cache, and then we can see caching cache files. So that's working. So if we actually change this to version 2, what happens, right? So what we want to do is make sure that files from old caches don't remain there, even though we're not going to use them. So in the activate event, what we can do is another wait until. And then this time, what we want to do is loop through everything that's in the cache and then remove anything that corresponds to a cache name that is not this cache name. So the way we do this is caches.keys, then function cache names. So this is all the cache names. So return promise.all. So cache names dot map function this cache name. So we're looping through everything in the cache and getting this particular one, and what we want to do is check. So if this cache name does not correspond to the current cache name, then we want to say console, let's log to the console that we're removing something. Service worker. So whoops, removing cached files from, and then let's say this cache name, and then what we want to do is return caches.delete this cache name. So let's see. So we're waiting until the activate event rather is waiting until this is resolved before it continues. So what's doing is going through all the keys in the cache and looping through everything. So looping through all of that and checking if they find something that the cache name does not correspond to this cache name, and it just deletes that. So let's try. So register that. Empty cache. So as you can see, because we're now in version 2, now says removing cached files from the version 1 cache. So before we actually start with this fetch event, what I want to do is go back into our app.js, and if you remember, there's supposed to be an image of Earth from NASA here, so we're going to do an HTTP request for that. So first of all, I'm just going to copy this function I did before, so it just performs the HTTP request, so we don't have to use jQuery or something for that. So then I'm gonna copy. So this is where we're getting the image from, just this. And then when we get it, if it's a success, what we do is this image here, we just set the source to the response URL. So I'm gonna refresh that. Let's just do a hard reload. Got in, and there you go. So now the problem with this obviously now is that it's going to have to load this. It's first of all going to have to perform the request to the API every time, and also load that image every time. But what we want is to actually cache it. So back in our service worker, at the fetch event, what we're going to use a different method. So here we're using wait until, but here we're going to use e.respond with. So here we're actually just responding to this fetch event with what we want it to be. So first thing we want to do is actually check in our cache whether the requested URL already exists. So caches.match e.request. So then function response. So two things, right? If it's in the cache, right? If response does exist. So let's just do console.log service worker. So found in cache. And then let's just pass e.request.url. So it's been found in the cache, and then all we have to do is just return the cached version, right? So we're not actually having to fetch it again. But if it's not found in the cache, what we want to do is actually just fetch it. So e.request and return that. So let's try. Let's unregister this again. Empty cache and hard reload. So it does that the first time. Okay. So what we see here is that this Google font, if you remember from here, we actually cached it the first time. So the next time that we tried to reload the page, it was found in the cache, and that is what was being loaded instead. Whereas for this, the Google API, the map of Earth, because it wasn't here, we still had to fetch it again. So what we want to do is actually change this so that if it's not actually found in the cache, when we fetch it, we should actually cache it as well. So the next time, they don't have to fetch it again. They can actually fetch the cached version instead. What we have to do first is actually clone the request and clone the response. And the reason we have to do this is because it's a stream, and if we want to use it more than once, we need to clone it, and I'll make more sense when we go down. So request clone equals to e.request.clone, right? So instead of returning this, right, so we're gonna fetch the request, right? Then function response. Response. So if there's no response, right, for whatever reason, just console.log service worker. So no response from fetch. Let's just put that and then just return it. Okay, but if we do get a response, first of all, we have to clone this response. So let's do response clone equals to response.clone. then what we need to do is similar to up here where we just cached all of these things. We need to open up the cache again. So I'm just going to copy this. Open up the cache again. Let's just close that. And then cache dot put. So we're going to put the request, and then response clone. So what you can see here, okay, let me actually return it, and then we're going to return this response. What you can see here is why we needed to clone. So we're using this request clone when we're fetching it, right? And we're using the original one here when we're putting it into the cache. So we can't use the same one, which is why we needed to clone it. And similarly, the response we get when we fetch it, we're using it first when we're caching it, and then we're using it second when we're returning it. So which is why we had to clone that as well. Finally, let's just do, so if this doesn't work, let's just add a little catch here. If for whatever reason it doesn't work. So service worker, so there was some error fetching and caching new data. And then let's add that error there. So let's go back and see what happens here. So I'm gonna register this again and empty cache and hard reload. So we can see installed, register, and you can see it takes a long time because first of all we're hitting the API, then we're having to get the image URL which is being served from the Google API engine. So when we reload again, what you can see here is first of all everything was a lot quicker because it was all coming from cache. So what you can see here is fetching all of this stuff. So the Google API, the Google font rather, was found in the cache, and also the image from NASA. So first of all, the API request to NASA was found in the cache, and second of all, the actual image itself was found in the cache. So if I were to turn off the Wi-Fi, which is what I'm about to do now, I've just done that, and I refresh the page, everything still loads. So that is pretty much it. We're back to where we started. So we have this image being loaded from NASA, and there's no Wi-Fi right now, so everything is being served from the cache. And we've done this with this basic service worker, and you can modify it in any way you want. So you can say, depending on what the URL is, we want to cache it, or if it's not a specific URL, we just want to fetch it, we don't want to actually cache everything. So you can modify it in any way. I'm going to have the links to everything down in the description, and thanks for watching.